Now introducing our Chief Communications Officer, Marissa Moran-Gantman.
Hi, welcome everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Marissa Moran-Gantman, Chief Communications Officer at the Pacific Council on International Policy. As we begin our event today, there is now officially a new president of the United States of America. Just a few hours ago, Joseph Biden was sworn in as the 46th president on the steps of the Capitol, and Kamala Harris was sworn in as Vice President of the United States, the first woman and the first Indian American and African American to ever hold that role. On this historic day, the Pacific Council President and CEO, Jerry Green, will be sharing an outlook for U.S. foreign policy under the new Biden administration. Jerry is a leading voice for global engagement here in Los Angeles. He has led the Pacific Council for more than a decade, and prior to that was a partner at Best Associates in Dallas, a privately held merchant banking firm with global operations. Jerry also served as Director of International Programs and Development at the RAND Corporation, where he oversaw the activities of the Center for Asia Pacific Policy, as well as the Center for Russia and Eurasia. He is an internationally recognized expert on foreign affairs, national security, and the Middle East. Jerry will deliver about 10 minutes of remarks, and then we'll go to audience question and answer. And you may use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions, or if you'd like to use the hand raise function also at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, to signal that you'd like us to turn on your audio or your video to ask your question, that's an option as well. So with no more delay, Jerry, over to you.
Thank you, Marissa. I also want to thank Samaya, who you don't see, but she's looming in the background, and Marissa and Samaya make a lot of this happen. So my thanks to both of you. I'm going to kind of speak quickly because I really want to try and cover a lot of ground today. Obviously, we will be revisiting this topic regularly for the next 4 years, but there's a lot to talk about. And I think that the thing that's most important to recognize is the United States is not going to go back to the way it was 4 years ago. There's sort of this expectation that a Biden administration will be able to magically take us back to where we were 4 years ago, and the world is a very different place, so that's unlikely to happen. Having said that, given his temperament, his personality, his experiences, he's going to be a deeply engaged international affairs foreign policy president. Biden prizes deeply his relationship with people, be they people on the train from Delaware to foreign heads of state. And he obviously is a fairly candid speaking guy. He has nothing good to say about Vladimir Putin, which will be refreshing. So he's very engaged in these issues. He's very interested in them. The team he has appointed, people say, well, it's Obama 3. These are a different way to look at it, as these are deeply seasoned, professional, experienced international affairs practitioners who really have their work cut out for them. The very first thing that needs to be done is we need to rebuild, President Biden and his team need to rebuild the institutions, the values, and the culture of our foreign policy mechanism. The CIA has been treated disrespectfully for the last 4 years. The Department of State has been gutted by successive secretaries of state who don't value the State Department, who don't value diplomacy. So this needs to be rebuilt. The Department of Defense needs to be rebuilt. Department of Homeland Security needs to be rebuilt. So Biden has his work cut out for him, because he needs to find a way to get us and our foreign policy practitioners back in the game. The world is skeptical about the United States. The very fact that the Capitol was overrun by a ranting mob of white supremacists does not give great confidence to the rest of the world about the stability and strength of democracy in the United States. And there's always a fear that we may slide back to where we were before. The rest of the world is not going to sit. It's not going to wait, for the United States. And the trust is gone. It's not gone permanently, but I do think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of skepticism around the planet about the United States, and it's going to take some time to earn that back. Also, our values. We need to, yet again, and President Biden will do this, restore our commitment to democracy, combat racism, get our own house in order. Much of what's going on in the United States is witnessed with shock, dismay, and horror in some places. You know, our criminal bungling of a global pandemic, issues between law enforcement and communities of color, institutional racism. These are not things that are new. The rest of the world is watching, and these are issues that President Biden is going to have to deal with. He made Susan Rice, this is an interesting appointment, the head of his domestic advisors group. She's a foreign policy person. So it shows what we've long argued at the Pacific Council, that there is a direct link between things happening domestically on the ground and international affairs. So I think this is a very good step. The next thing is we need a philosophical reboot. The whole notion of American first is not only selfish and short-sighted, it's counterproductive. If the United States does not exhibit a measure of global leadership, who will? Who would we like to do this? Would we like to cede global leadership to China, for example? And the answer clearly is not. So it's going to take some time, but we have to get more involved in global alliances. We are rejoining, or we are re-engaging with the World Health Organization. Anthony Fauci is attending a meeting of their executive board next week. We are rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. We are eliminating the ban on Muslims being able to get visas to the United States. Many of these American first conceits need to be unwound so that the United States will be a respected member of the international community again, and not simply be seen as bullying, hectoring, and thinking of itself over the rest of the world. One of the things we learned from a global pandemic is that, you know, traditional borders and boundaries and so forth do not immunize anybody or any country from the rest of the world. So this notion of America first, us walled out from the rest of the world, simply makes no sense, and it's counterproductive. So there's a philosophical reboot that we are likely to see. I would imagine, for example, that President Biden may participate in the Munich Security Forum, where he goes every year, and he went last year, and he said to the rest of the countries that were there, the United States will be back. They are skeptical, as they should be, but we are going to be, we're going to see in international affairs, a foreign policy, very, very different than anything we've seen in recent years. Let me talk about specific cases. I'm going to do this really quickly, but we'll have time for questions. The first is Mexico. You remember the last administration, the first international trip was taken to Saudi Arabia, which to this day, mystifies me. Generally, the first trip is to Mexico. I say this, in part because we're in Southern California, so we are closer to Mexico City than we are to Washington. But Mexico is uniquely important. President AMLO, as he is affectionately called, was a big fan of President Trump. He appears to be ambivalent about President Biden. It took him a long time to recognize that Biden had even won the election. But having said that, this is a good time for a reboot in U.S.-Mexican relations, where there have been some challenges and some problems. And I think it's important. Also, Canada. We have treated Canada shamelessly, disrespectfully, in my view. The Canadians have been enormously helpful to us, standing up for human rights issues in Saudi Arabia when we didn't and should have, in my view, in dealing with China, where they are holding the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, who may be extradited to the United States, and Canadians have been arrested and thrown in Chinese prisons to punish the Canadians for their support of us while we denigrate them. So we are really, we owe a lot to Canada, and we really need to treat Canada with greater respect, greater value, and the like. In terms of Latin America, Cuba, I just made in my notes, Cuba we need to fix. Venezuela, we will leave as we are. In other words, to identify Cuba as a supporter of terrorism, to go back to the bad old days of trying to punish Cuba and bully Cuba, it simply won't work. If we want reform in Cuba, we need to be forward-leaning and positive and engage Cuba in a way that will lead to an organic change rather than trying to force them into being something that they're not willing to do. This is very different than Venezuela, where there is an illegitimate government. It's not recognized by the rest of the world, including the US. So I imagine we will stay the course in Venezuela, but we'll see a very different tone in terms of dealing with Cuba. Europe, again, NATO has been belittled. Brexit has been cheered with great enthusiasm, if not great wisdom. The European Union has been criticized and spoken of disrespectfully. In part, I think that if we wish to have an impact on our policy with China, we need to re-engage with the EU, because the EU and the United States are going to be far more influential in influencing China than we will doing it independently. Certainly, some of the NATO countries have upped their commitments to their defense budgets, for which we should be pleased. But at the end of the day, there's a sort of cultural relationship between the United States and the EU and NATO, which needs to be restored. Africa is the continent which people talk about episodically and don't really do anything. And indeed, the United States needs to re-engage with Africa. Secretary of State Tillerson traveled all around Africa, criticizing the Africans for accepting support from the Chinese while not offering anything in turn. This is not a party issue. President George W. Bush is enormously popular in Africa because things that he did to combat HIV and to support the Africans. But the United States needs to re-engage in Africa, take Africa seriously, promote the same democratic values that we do elsewhere. And Samantha Power, who was our ambassador to the UN, is now the head of AID, the Agency for International Development. She is the person, I think, who is well equipped to help us engage with China, with Africa rather, and to take it seriously. And our new ambassador to the United Nations also is an expert on Africa as well. The Middle East, I don't see huge changes. We are not going to move the embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. Everybody is supportive of the peace agreement between the Israelis and the UAE and the Moroccans and the Sudanese and so forth. I think what's been missing here is recognition of the importance of the Palestine question and the importance to the vitality of Israeli democracy and the vitality of the state of Israel, which depends, in my view, and the view I suspect of the Biden administration, in an equitable recognition of the importance of the Palestine question, not only to the Palestinians, but also to the Israelis. So I hope that Palestine, it becomes part of U.S. foreign policy, which I suspect it will. We've also found ourselves somewhat more attached to the heads of state in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Turkey than is seemly for a country that is allegedly in the business of promoting democracy. So I do think that there will be some changes in Middle East policy. And finally, the hardy perennial, which is Iran. I don't see the Biden administration jumping into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, tomorrow. But President Biden has said that he, wishes to try and resuscitate that, to improve it. Wendy Sherman and Anthony Blinken were instrumental in making this deal. And I think we need to deal with Iran in a different way. To oppose humanitarian aid to Iran at the time of a global pandemic is cruel, it's stupid, it's un-American. There are ways that we can engage the Iranians without appearing to fall in love with the Iranian government, which is a challenge regionally and to the Iranian people. Russia continues to be a major challenge. The love affair with Putin, which I've never understood, is gone. Biden has been very clear in his comments about Putin, as was John McCain when he was alive, and others. We are going to be dealing with Russia in very, very different ways, and with far less self-indulgent, engaging in our elections in a fraudulent way. The development of their arms program, threatening Eastern Europe, and a variety of other things. We need to address Russia in a much more instrumental way. South Asia, Pakistan, India, a lot to do. These are both nuclear powers, no love lost between them, and the relationship between India and China has deteriorated in a way that is threatening to global security and something that we need to address. Again, let me be really clear. I'm not advocating we need to send troops. We need to be the global policemen for all of these countries. But at the end of the day, if we want to expand our global influence and promote a degree of global stability, we can't be inattentive to these issues. And conflict between India and China is something that we need to be aware of. China, again, is a major preoccupation. China is likely to be the main focal point of U.S. foreign policy. The issues in respect to Taiwan are very sensitive. What's going on in Hong Kong is a major problem. What's going on in Xinjiang, and specifically it's been referred to as genocide, continues to be an issue. The South China Sea, Chinese development of artificial intelligence, it's soft power diplomacy, which has been very effective. It's mask diplomacy in light of the pandemic, the Belt and Road Initiative, and fear amongst China's neighbors, who turn to the United States for some measure of support, are going to occupy a major portion of this administration's foreign policy attention. Finally, I want to end with themes, and then we'll open it up. And I'm sorry I've gone on longer than I should, but there's a lot to talk about. Cyber issues are important. Climate change is something that we need to accept global leadership on, and we need to address meaningfully. Senator John Kerry, former Senator and Secretary of State John Kerry, is the climate czar, which elevates the climate issue to where it needs to occupy. Is very good news. The promotion of democracy, the recognition of human rights and the importance of human rights. Immigration reform, not only in terms of the United States, but people being pushed out of their countries at times because of violence, at times because of environmental degradation, climate change, and so forth. Food security, water security, global health, in terms, the pandemic being the best example at all, and gross inequities in terms of who's going to get vaccinated and who's not, who's going to get vaccine. I mean, this is something that's going to continue for a great deal of time. In short, this is a reboot. It's a slow process. We've lost crucial time, and the United States needs to get back in the game. And I am, optimistic. I'm a very cynical guy, so I criticize everybody. But since the inauguration was only 3 hours ago, let's wait and see. We're not going to get it right, but I definitely think we're likely to see a significant improvement. Sorry to go on so long. Marissa, over to you for questions.
Hi, Jerry. Thanks so much for that.
Okay.
We are open now for questions from the audience, so you can send your questions through the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. You could also raise your hand through the hand raise function. You'll also see a little hand next to that Q&A box if you're interested in asking your question on screen, and we can find a way to do that. In the meantime, while people are thinking of their questions, Jerry, I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate a little bit. I know you mentioned Mexico at the beginning.
Sure.
Of course, the Pacific Council has a focus area on Mexico in our programs and where we hope to have impact. And in particular, we've shared out with the membership that we're working on a memo for the Biden administration that has been, put together and really contributed by a bunch of experts in our membership and beyond. If there's anything else that you want to share on Mexico or regarding that memo in particular.
Sure. No, absolutely. Mexico is of special importance to us in Southern California. I always, as I mentioned earlier, we're closer to Mexico City than we are to Washington in terms of distance. And under the leadership of Michael Camuñoz, who's a member of our board of directors and an expert on Mexico, the Pacific Council has been engaged in a Mexico initiative for a number of years. A pandemic is the best example of the porosity of borders. We can build, walls from now to the cows come home, but germs have a way of circumventing walls and borders and so forth. And what we believe in Southern California is we need a bridge to Mexico. We don't need walls. We have something called the MEXLA Commission, which is a relationship between the office of Mayor Eric Garcetti and the Mexican Foreign Ministry. AMLO is clearly not a fan of President Biden. President Biden sort of specializes in reluctant buddies. And what we really need to be doing with our Mexican neighbors is working on trade issues, environmental issues, public health issues, and so forth. So I think it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen easily. I mean, there already have been issues. Julian Assange was offered political asylum by Mexico at the very time that the United States is trying to get him extradited to the United States from the United Kingdom. That is not helpful. The former Mexican Minister of Defense was arrested in Los Angeles for drug trafficking. The Mexican government was able to persuade the U.S. government to return him. He was exonerated in 15 minutes. A lot of DEA intercepts and precious intelligence was pushed into the open source world by the Mexican government. So these are issues between the United States and Mexico. But geography is not going to change. And Mexico has a considerable population of people in the United States, DACA recipients, immigrants, undocumented people, documented people, US citizens who have a deep interest in this relationship with Mexico. So this is something that we really should be turning our attention to immediately. I will be very curious to see who our ambassador is to Mexico. I think that's a very, very important appointment. And the Biden administration can count on us to support this. We have a very close relationship with the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations called COMEXI. For us, this is local politics. This is local politics, and it is a matter of major consequence to us in California and to the Mexicans who realize that California has the 5th largest economy in the world, and so forth.
Thanks, Jerry. We have another question from Lucy Santora. This is actually a really great practical question. She asks, for those of us who are in support of Biden's agenda but are in conservative circles, how should we approach people-to-people interactions to promote unity and make headway on important cross-sector policies?
What a wonderful question. We are very, very big on good citizenship. We at the Pacific Council, we don't care who you voted for. I mean, I don't mean the question. I mean, we don't care we want people to vote. At the end of the day, it's up to them to choose the candidate. And I think that this notion of people to people, what we call subnational diplomacy, the relationship between the City Hall, our mayor, our deputy mayor for international affairs, Ambassador Nina Hachigian, and the Mexican government is augmenting what comes out of the federal government. So I think people-to-people diplomacy is really, really important. And this is, soft power, but soft power is power of a very, very genuine sort. I think that I proudly call myself a globalist. That has become an epithet. That's become insulting. It's somehow that we are seditious. We're traitors to the United States because we understand the global role of the United States. So I think showing some sensitivity to other countries, understanding, empathy, promoting people-to-people exchanges, more students I think it would be great if more students came from Iran to UCLA and USC than fewer students, because they would all go back to Iran, and these would be people that would be advocates for closer relationships with the United States, not to mention US students going to Iran, which will happen at some point. So that's kind of the ethos of the Pacific Council, and it's a really, really good question and important.
Great. Next question is from someone in the audience. I don't think they identified themselves, which is fine. The question is, how do you expect the Biden administration will deal with North Korean nuclear weapons and missiles? Will it go back to the Obama era's strategic patience, or will it adopt some of Trump's engagement approach?
Well, Trump's engagement approach was simultaneously embarrassing and a failure. And this is not a partisan political observation. It's a reality. It suddenly gave the Korean leadership far more value and far more global visibility than it deserved, and we didn't expect anything in return. So that's the first thing. Knowing Biden, as not that we went to high school together, but knowing of his record as I do, if there was a reason to engage the North Koreans, he would do it, but he certainly would not give it away. The problem with the Koreans is there's always an expectation that the Chinese have more influence in North Korea than I believe they do. And the Chinese, regard North Korea with a different type, but the same degree of horror that we do, because they are as vulnerable to North Korean irresponsibility as we are, albeit in different ways. To engage high-level diplomatic conversations, not by heads of state, but by someone who is a special emissary for North Korea, or to talk to the North Korean diplomats at the United Nations. We certainly should find a way to engage with North Korea. But North Korea has a genius for playing this rope-a-dope game, that they bring people in, they engage, and at the end of the day, the North Koreans benefit far more than those who are engaging with them. So I think North Korea is hugely important, but it needs to be dealt with in a somewhat more effective, constructive way. Using traditional diplomatic means, recognizing the severe limitations we have in influencing the North Koreans, largely because Kim Jong-un has such a hold on his country that he is able to force his people to accept a very high level of suffering if that's the consequence, and there's not a lot they or we can do about it. So it's a high priority, but a very challenging portfolio.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Next question comes from Nancy Rosenblum, who asks, will ambassadors be confirmed with a simple majority vote so we can get people into place quickly and rapidly? And this also goes for the cabinet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've already been, hi, Nancy, I should be sorry to not greet you properly. I've been watching, this has all happened in the last 24 hours. Senator Hawley has already created problems for Alejandro Mayorkas, because he's not convinced that Mayorkas is given adequate answers to what we're going to do about the wall. And I know what we're going to do about the wall. We're not going to build any new walls, and we're not going to tear down any walls that have been built. I mean, it's actually very straightforward. So some are going to be more engaged with political mischief than others, and I think we need this to unfold in terms of confirmation of the cabinet. In terms of ambassadors, my guess is that there will be a fewer number of political appointees than there has been traditionally, but President Biden has a deep bench of people who he knows and is close to, who could be political appointees, who will be absolutely stellar ambassadors. What's interesting is how Congress is going to deal with this, and it's simply impossible to tell. It is in the nation's interest to allow the Biden administration to get to work as quickly as possible on dealing with these issues. The takeover of the Congress, the attack by mobs of the Congress, shows why Homeland Security needs to get together and to do its work. But they're all, you never know. We need to get a waiver for General Austin, who was recently a general officer, to become Secretary of Defense. So all of these have potential complications. So we'll have to see how it plays out on the Hill. But I think time is of the essence. And then certain portfolios having to do with public health, vaccine production, all of that related to the pandemic, really lives are being lost while people are sitting around politicking. So that needs to move very, very quickly.
I think it will be really fascinating to see how Homeland Security evolves, in particular, given the new threats that we're seeing now in this country. We have two questions from Keegan Gizzard, who asks, what, in your opinion, are the best next steps to include Cuba in opportunity? And secondly, what points of leverage does the US have to push the conversation in Jerusalem about slowing Israeli annexation?
The first one about Cuba, look, we do have issues with Cuba and the Cubans, by arguing in favor of engaging the Cubans. People who tend to think the way I think are not arguing that we should give away the farm. Let me give you one example. A number of American diplomats at our embassy in Havana were adversely affected by some mysterious ailment, which we still are not 100% knowledgeable where it came from, and it could have come from Cuban intelligence, some arm of the Cuban government. So we are not completely aligned with Cuba. The question is, how do we find a way to re-engage with Cuba, which is cognizant of our values, our expectations, our commitment to democracy, human rights, and so forth. And many countries simply don't respond to bullying. So I think that we need to find a way to engage Cuba. Interestingly, the Secretary for Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, who's a Pacific Council member and is from Los Angeles, is a Cuban American. His parents immigrated from Cuba to the United States when he was a child. There's a deep bench of people with significant expertise and engaging Cuba. And the question is, how do we help Cuba as it sort of gradually marches away or limps away from the Castro legacy to a future which is as yet unclear and uncertain. Sorry, Marissa, what was the second question? Just give me a key word.
It was asking about Jerusalem. What points?
Oh, Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What point, do you want me to reread it, or okay?
Yeah. No. Again, it's interesting because the contrast between the two administrations, the outgoing and the incoming, on the issue of West Bank settlements, could not be more different. And the American ambassador to Israel, the prior ambassador, was hugely sympathetic to settlement building, to settlers, to all of these other things. And clearly the history and the track record of the Biden, not only the Biden team is certainly very, very supportive of the state of Israel. That's not a question. The question is what state of Israel? What is that state of Israel meant to look like? Which elements within Israel are most likely to resonate with the interests of the Biden administration? And everybody is delighted with the agreements with the UAE and Morocco and Sudan. I mean, these are not as earth-shattering as we were told they were. But at the end of the day, it's all about the Palestine question. If we are committed to Israeli national security over the long term, which we all are, and there's simply different philosophical views of what's best for Israel. To be very candid, my view is that the Palestine question needs to be ameliorated because it's in the interest of the Jewish state of Israel and Israel as a democracy to deal with this. This is not simply altruism to the Palestinians. These are core concerns about the state of Israel. How this administration is going to deal with this issue, we will have to see. But there's a long track record of them doing. I mean, minimally now, let's start talking to the Palestinians. Let's just allow the Palestinians to reopen their de facto embassy in Washington, which was closed down. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done. And it's certainly not the very top of our list, but it certainly needs to be on the list. Next.
Okay, we have a question from Anonymous. What do you think of the executive actions that Biden has committed to immediately upon entering office as they relate to foreign policy? So probably thinking immigration is the one in particular. What are some of the most important actions to look out for in the administration's first 30 days?
Yeah, well, the first 30 days and the first 100 days is fighting this pandemic. That dominates and governs everything we do. Co-equal to that is getting the American economy back where it needs to be. This has been very, very costly in terms of human life. 400,000 people have perished as a result of this, and it didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that way. So certainly foreign policy is going to be an issue, but I think the really immediate issue is getting our arms around this pandemic, speeding up the production of vaccine, speeding up getting the vaccine into people's arms, getting the economy back where it needs to be, and so forth. Also, let's not forget a gang of white supremacists overran the United States Capitol building a week ago. There are profoundly dangerous, disruptive tendencies in the United States now, which are a genuine threat to American democracy as we understand it. So those issues need to be dealt with as well. I mean, Biden is quite sincere in his desire to engage. I have this vision of him and Mitch McConnell, on the phone talking a lot. And, part of this is what's McConnell willing to do, what's the Republican Party going to do, what's going to happen on Capitol Hill, and so forth. But those are the most immediate. In terms of the executive actions on day one, get us back in the Paris Climate Accord, provide relief to the DACA, the Dreamers, the DACA people in the United States. All of those make stopping the Keystone Pipeline project. They probably have a list that's a mile long, and I am very enthusiastic about most of them. Stopping construction of the wall along the border with Mexico, which is just a colossal waste of money. So I think in the coming days, we will be seeing a lot more. But the nice thing about executive actions is they can be undone as quickly as they are done, and they need to be. The other problem this administration is going to face is, the search for a conviction in the wake of the impeachment, and they got to get the country operating. That would be very time consuming. Many people feel that needs to be done. Others feel not. So they're going to have to deal with that as well.
Great. We have a question from Pacific Council member Alex Sue, who asks, what do you foresee happening with the military commissions in Guantanamo Bay, which of course is very relevant to the work the Pacific Council does?
It's interesting that if we call this administration Obama 3, which people have, Obama said, on the first day of his office, he was going to close Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay is still there. And now because of the pandemic, people aren't able as easily to travel to Guantanamo Bay. They're now seeking funding to build a geriatric wing at Guantanamo Bay because a lot of the detainees are getting older, and if they get seriously ill with sort of older people maladies, they don't know what to do with them. I mean, this is certainly people responsible for 9/11 need to be brought to book. They need to be tried. I'm very sympathetic to that. But the infrastructure and all of the things that are surrounding this have not made that any easier. And the inmate or the detainee population is gradually diminishing. And there are some people that need to be released and they can't get a country to accept them. So I imagine this will continue to drag out as it has been. Symbolically to the rest of the world, Guantanamo Bay is not something that that earns us a great deal of respect from other countries. But having said that, this has become kind of an old story, and the disrespect with which we are regarded around the world, there are things that now supersede Guantanamo Bay. So it's a very interesting question. We have our task force. We've written 2 reports. We've helped to support congressional legislation on this issue. So it's a great moment and interest to the Pacific Council, but it's a really interesting question, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Okay, it looks like we might have a question from Charles Carmona. Charles, we've opened your microphone if you do want to ask a question over your audio.
Hi, Charles.
It might have been a mistake, so no problem if that's not the case.
I'm sure has a question.
There he is.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't have a question. My phone just sort of done it, but it's fascinating. Please continue.
All right. Well, Charles, it's the question I expected Charles to ask, so I'm going to ask it for him. Is Charles is someone with significant business interests in the People's Republic of China and in Hong Kong. So I was expecting a question from Charles about Hong Kong and about the mainland. So I'm going to guess something that he might have asked, which is, what is a likely outcome in Hong Kong? Where is this likely to take us? And I think at the end of the day, we are not going to be able to reverse this decline in Hong Kong, but perhaps we can make the decline somewhat less precipitous than it has been before. Hong Kong, as part of the deal between the Chinese and the UK, was expected to unfold in a particular way, and it's not unfolding at the pace and in the fashion that was expected. And indeed, the overt opposition to democratic political activists in Hong Kong, in part, was permitted because the Chinese did not believe that anybody would step up and do anything about it. And indeed, they have been right. So one thing to wonder about is how the United States is going to handle this. Kurt Campbell, who was a longtime expert on Asian issues, is the senior person back at the National Security Council dealing with Asia issues. And he is not a timid soul when it comes to China. But this long list of issues I enumerated having to do with China, Hong Kong, where I know Charles does a good bit of business, is really, really important. That if we're going to allege to be leaders in the promotion of democracy, we actually need to stand up and deal with it. And Hong Kong is a very important laboratory in which we need to articulate our view much more aggressively and constructively than we have to date, in which we basically ignored everything that's going on there. Oh, Charles, I hope I didn't do you a disservice. So if you hated anything in that question, this is on me, not on you.
That was perfect.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Not
you.
even planned. We have time for one more question, and that's from Jeremy Clark Watson, who asks, do you see any likely changes in U.S. policy towards the Indo-Pacific, including ties with India, Japan, and other alliance partners? And do you see Biden approaching, how do you see Biden approaching APEC and other regional organizations this year?
This question is, I don't want to call out our questioner, but he is a respected member of the diplomatic community here in Los Angeles who has not only a special interest in this question, but special expertise in this question. I am still mourning the fact that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, never became a reality. This is something that we worked on, not Jerry Green personally, but the Obama administration and others worked on with great energy that would have given us extraordinary influence in the Indo-Pac region, and which ultimately we walked away from to our detriment, while at the same time the Chinese are promoting regional economic arrangements that benefit China and don't benefit the United States. Our allies and our friends in that part of the world are very, very concerned about the US being no-shows, the United States not really being sufficiently supportive of regional stability, and working to counteract Chinese efforts to turn this all into a Chinese lake in which the Chinese have regional dominance in a way that they are unchallenged. I think that China is likely to be the centerpiece of U.S. policy under the Biden administration for exactly the reasons that were suggested in this question, and then all the other things that I mentioned in terms of China. I think that the Australians, the New Zealanders, and all of our friends in that part of the world are going to find a willing partner in the United States, because what needs to be done is the absolute antithesis of America first. And this is not that we're going to commit large numbers of troops all over Asia, but we are going to show up. We are going to work with our partners. We are going to support our partners. And Kurt Campbell, who I mentioned earlier, was the one that helped to promote the pivot to Asia back in the day. And I wasn't thrilled with the way in which that was articulated, but it made very, very good sense. And it does today. Asia is where the action is, and specifically China. So, our allies are watching and waiting with bated breath, including allies like Vietnam, our erstwhile rival, which is now one of our closest collaborators in Asia, to make sure that the United States is going to get dealt back in the game. They're not going to hedge their bets and go all in for the United States, because we've lost a tremendous amount of credibility. But I do think we will find willing partners, and I can tell our partners in Asia that they will find a willing partner in this administration, without a doubt, without a doubt.
Wonderful. Jerry, thank you so much for these valuable insights today. And thank you so much to everybody who tuned in, whether you're a Pacific Council member or joining us for the first time. Our next event open to the public is actually going to be a special address with Mayor Eric Garcetti on Wednesday, February 3rd at 12:30. You can find information about that at our website, pacificcouncil.org. Jerry, I don't know if you want to make any closing remarks or any final words.
Yeah, let me make, I would. We are not a political organization. We don't call ourselves bipartisan, because that means that we're sort of, have feet in both camps. We are nonpartisan. We are nonpartisan. We are not political. We had members that were members of the Trump administration at very high levels. We have very good connection to the Biden administration. We are all about global engagement, which, as I said earlier, has become an epithet. People, socialists, globalists, as if this all goes together. You can't live in California and not be a globalist. You cannot live in California and not value diversity, inclusion, polyglotism, immigration, and a whole variety of other things. So if we have a bias as an organization, that's it. We don't buy, and this is not a political observation, we don't buy this notion of American first, which is synonymous from the United States disengaging from the rest of the world. And we do believe in good citizenship. Shame on me. I believe in diplomacy. I believe in the State Department. I believe in the CIA. I believe in, these are all things that are central to our lives as Californians, and our organizational considerations of the Pacific Council. I do think we need to step up and be part of the process. I've said this for the last 4 years, and I say it now. Our job is very much the same. Which is to be committed to these things and to be good citizen diplomats, so which we can do. So with that, I will thank all of you for participating. Forgive my fragmentary answers. This administration is 5 hours old, so there's a lot we don't know, but it certainly we're in for interesting times. So please, everybody, stay very, very healthy. Marissa, thank you, and Samaya, thank you as well.
Thanks, everyone.